Yeah, the technical things, what did you answer?
So is it just as long as we do 9 summers, it doesn't matter which weeks?
It doesn't matter which, so it basically allows you a couple of break weeks if you like, or one break week if you like. You see what I'm saying? It also allows you in golf what's known as a mulligan. So that a mulligan is if you swing and you miss or you hit it really badly, you do it over again. Only bad golfers get that, but in this class you're allowed that. So you're allowed to submit 9 and have the best 8 count. So a lot of people in the class have just done their 8, and then if they're happy with their grades on their 8, they just stop. And others people do their 9th and things like that. It gives you that flexibility. Or if there's some week where you're just incredibly busy, it allows you to skip a week. And yeah, that's exactly the reason why it's set up that way. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, shall we get stuck into the readings for this week? Okay, so before we dive into your questions, maybe we'll just kind of talk about what do you think about these readings. You know, what is indigenous psychology to you now after these different readings?
I think for me, I answered the second question, so I probably can answer.
Oh, you know what would really help? Give us your name when you speak, just so that I'll learn everyone's name.
So I'm Lauren.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that I found from reading, especially the ones focusing on Māori and Indigenous psychology, not the international one so much, were the issues that I didn't know about that would be potentially overcome by a well-made Indigenous psychology. Things like the like this abnormalization concept through like the clinical practice of of psychologists and even the sort of the education system stuff about how it's starting off in these high school years and they're sort of on the back foot, and then it's just this snowball of this is, so I think that was one of the things I took this week. Yeah.
Great. So that's one of the major motivations behind Indigenous psychology, is that you have to realize the majority of people on the planet are probably more like Maori than they are like Americans. All right, because that's just by sheer numbers. And yet, for Maori it's particularly salient because they live as a minority within a westernized country. But this is happening in the global context as well, in the sense that I spent my sabbatical in Beijing last year, and the young students in Beijing, the only journal they read is the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. So JPSP is the best American, social psych journal. Very science-oriented, very experimental, and very much, I hate to say it, about American culture. So essentially, I would go through in just waves of dissonance because I was living in Beijing. I was seeing all sorts of really interesting and fascinating things happening in Beijing, and somehow the Chinese people in Beijing were voluntarily surrendering their own indigenously compatible psychological systems for this holy grail of doing scientific research that had the goal of being published in JPSP, which, by the way, virtually none of them will be able to do. I mean, publishing in JPSP, I don't want to downplay it because they're very difficult. There's a lot of skill that goes into them, and very few students have the skill to do that without a skilled mentor teaching them how to do it. So you're right. So that is essentially a motivation for Indigenous psychology, is this indigenous compatibility. That you're not forcing people into a mode that may not be suited for their mental well-being. Yeah, so that's a good one. So anyone else?
Sorry, I'm Bridget. Yep. I think what kind of stood out to me, I did the second question as well, and what stood out was almost what wasn't there. Like we were looking at an Indigenous psychology, but it was an Indigenous psychology for Maori people. But we've actually got a really big Pacific population in New Zealand as well. And then there's also like so many other cultures coming in as there's more and more people, like refugees and stuff coming in. And it sort of made me think, like, at work we've got cultural advisors, and our cultural advisor is Maori, but he's just been asked to work with the Pacific services, and I'm like, but he's Maori, and that's the Pacific services, and that's just like saying, well, you have dark skin, so you can go and work with those people. And it just, yeah, I guess I just sort of, I felt like I learned heaps about Maori Indigenous psychology, but that there's other Indigenous psychologies needed, and I guess Pacific stood out.
Excellent. So essentially what Bridget is doing is trying to connect up the various dots. So essentially, I mean, one of the reasons why in the first week I tend not to give models out is I don't actually want to tell you anything. I want you to, in discussion, discover what this thing is about. Because if you discover it yourself, you'll actually know it, learn it, and remember it. If someone tells you what it is, you know, I mean, I've said it in so many lectures, and somebody else who says it, right? So let's follow that up, because she's essentially connecting up. I've actually chosen 4 papers that are not traditionally labeled as Indigenous Psych. Only 2 of them are traditionally labeled as Indigenous Psych, the Young paper and the Allwood Berry. That special issue is really a special issue, not about Indigenous psychology, but about what treaty-based, what is it, treaty-based? Yeah, treaty-based psychology. And I guess what we're running into is there tension then between the 2 Indigenous psychology papers and the way they framed what Indigenous psychology was, and the way that an Indigenous psychology, because I think this is an Indigenous psychology, was framed for Aotearoa, New Zealand. So would anyone like to follow up on that, with this idea here that what happens with, is there a psychology for New Zealand? Is that different than a psychology for Maori?
That's Sarah. That's kind of what I was going to say before, because I did the first question, and what kind of struck me is that culture, when you study psychology, is usually viewed in terms of a national culture as opposed to little parts. And that Indigenous psychologies, like in New Zealand, we could have several Indigenous psychologies. And I think I use the Philippines as an example with all the different dialects. They could all have different smaller Indigenous psychologies.
Okay, okay, so now we run into this problem. New Zealand is this little country of 4 million people. Definitely punches above its weight, okay, in terms of its prevalence in psych info and all this kind of, not as much as the Netherlands, I'm sorry to say. Netherlands is the country that punches most above its weight, together with Israel. But New Zealand is way above its weight. Can we create several Indigenous psychologies just for the small group of 4 million people? The Philippines is a perfect example. I didn't assign you papers from the Philippines, but there is a singular Filipino Indigenous psychology. Unfortunately, Jenna is not here, but it's and it's not plural. It's singular. And you're absolutely right. The Philippines has something like 4,000 languages, or I don't know the number, but it's a lot, okay? And maybe it's 4,000 islands and 300 languages or something like that. It's huge. But they portray it as having an Indigenous psychology for the Philippines. I'm going to meet a lot of Filipinos in a couple of days when I go to that Indigenous psychology. I'm going to ask them that question. So what do you guys think?
But in the Yang article, he, is it a he? I was thinking it was he. He did say that when the non-Western psychology, so I guess the Indigenous psychology is strong enough, then almost like get an assimilated psychology where it kind of takes both the Western and the local, the Indigenous psychology. And I feel like that's something that could happen in New Zealand, but I feel like there needs to be an Indigenous psychology first, or else it's just going to be a Western based assimilated psychology, like made up based on Western ideas, because we don't have the good, strong Indigenous psychology to go along with it.
I would say that would be, okay, so do you ever get Guo Shu Yang, his name in Chinese is Yang Guoshu. He's kind of the godfather of Indigenous psychology in Taiwan. He would like it to be Chinese Indigenous psychology, but for political reasons it's very difficult. So I was just amazed at how little impact that line of work had in Beijing. The Beijingers, the only thing they cared about was what was published in America. And they almost like